Hittites, lords of bronze and iron. Long before the empires of Babylon thundered in the east, before the pyramids had whispered their secrets to the Nile, and even before the Greeks began shaping myths into marble, there was Anatolia, a land cradled between mountains and seas, carved by time and fire. It was here, amid river valleys and high plateaus, that the story of the Hittites quietly began. The people who would one day be called the Hittites were not always so. In the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Anatolia was already home to ancient peoples, the Hattians in the north, the Hurrians to the east, and scattered tribes who tilled the soil and worshipped gods of storm and sun. These early inhabitants left no kingdoms of stone, but their voices echoed in the land through sacred groves, megalithic shrines, and the steady rhythm of the plough. Then, from beyond the Caucasus or the steppes, we cannot say for certain, came new peoples. They spoke an early Indo-European tongue, kin to those that would later rise in Persia, in Greece, and in Rome. These newcomers were not conquerors at first. They settled, mingled, married. Their language, sharp and foreign, began to blend with the voices of the land. Over centuries, the tongues of the Hattians and the newcomers interwove, and from this union arose a new people, the Nesians. They called themselves, after their city Nesha. But history would remember them by another name, taken from the land they came to rule, the Hittites. Unlike the Egyptians who built in limestone and sunlight, or the Sumerians who carved their deeds in clay, the early Hittites left behind only the faintest footprints. Their ancestors farmed and traded. They built no vast cities, not yet, but lived in fortified settlements perched on hills, with wooden walls and stone foundations. Bronze tools in hand, they tamed the earth, their cattle, and themselves. Their gods were many, and most were taken from older peoples, storm gods from the Hattians, sun deities from further south, and household spirits to guard hearth and home. Even in their earliest days, the Hittites showed a gift for absorbing the beliefs of others and making them their own. By the dawn of the 2nd millennium BC, this fusion of cultures began to coalesce into something more. Trade routes stretched like veins across Anatolia, linking the plains of the Halys River with distant Mesopotamia. Assyrian merchants came, bringing with them tin, textiles, and writing. With them also came the cuneiform tablet, and with writing, memory. In this new world of trade and treaties, the Hittites stepped forward. They began to write, to rule, to remember. And so began their long ascent, not in a blaze of conquest, but in the slow heartbeat of the land itself. The story of kings and storms, of iron and fire, of gods and men, had begun. In the heart of Anatolia, among gentle hills and murmuring rivers, lay a modest city called Nesha. It was not yet the center of an empire, nor even the seat of a king. But it held a treasure that would shape the Hittite world, the art of writing. The people of Nesha were traders and farmers, their hands calloused from toil, their minds tuned to the rhythms of seasons and trade. Yet among them moved foreigners, merchants from distant Ashur, who brought with them more than tin and cloth. They brought the word. In clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped signs, the Assyrians recorded their contracts, letters, and prayers. They kept tallies of debts and gods alike. And slowly, patiently, the people of Nesha learned to do the same. Here, amid grain silos and market stalls, the Hittites first inscribed their language into permanence. They called it the language of Nesha, Nesali. In it they began to recount laws, rituals, oaths. It was a language of both men and gods, of kings and commoners. This act of writing, of capturing speech in clay, became the foundation upon which all Hittite history would rest. Nesha was no mighty fortress. Its walls were modest, its palaces simple. But it was rich in spirit. Here, power was not yet absolute, but negotiated among local lords, priesthoods, and councils. The early rulers were less emperors than chiefs, bound by tradition, alliance, and the ever-watchful eyes of their peers. Among these early figures, one name would later be whispered in reverence: Pithana. A chieftain from Kasara, a small kingdom to the south, he conquered Nesha not with fire, but with intent. He claimed no divine right, yet his actions echoed with destiny. His son, Anitta, would go further still. Anitta left us one of the oldest known inscriptions in the Hittite tongue. Etched in stone, his words declared, "I, Anitta, king of Kasara, conquered Hattusa and laid it waste." That name, Hattusa, would soon become the heart of an empire. But for now, it lay in ruins, cursed and silent. Anitta's voice, preserved through centuries of earth and fire, speaks not of myth, but of ambition. He was not yet a Hittite as we understand them. But in his conquests, his writings, and his sense of legacy, he laid the foundations. Thus, from the markets of Nesha and the ambitions of Khusran kings, a path began to form. A path that led northward, to the stony heights of Hattusa. A place once destroyed, but destined to rise again. Far to the north of Nesha, where the Harles River carved its slow arc through the Anatolian plateau, lay a rugged land of oak forests and basalt hills. Here, nestled amid rocky outcrops, stood a site once smitten by fire and declared cursed by Anitta, Hattusa. But curses seldom endure when ambition is strong and the gods are listening. In time, a leader arose who would defy that ancient malediction. His name, remembered in later annals with reverence and awe, was Labana. Some say he was a descendant of Anitta, others that he rose from obscurity. What matters is not where he came from, but what he built. Labana, or perhaps his successor, who took the same name, did what no man had dared since Hattusa's fall. He marched his people north, past the river bends and into the highlands. And there, upon the crumbled stones of old Hattien walls, he laid the foundations of a new city, a new kingdom, and a new destiny. He did not rule as a tribal chief, but as a king of many lands. His title was not taken lightly. Labana sent out his sons and generals, bearing seals and commands, to subdue the surrounding cities, Zalpa, Tuwanuwa, Hupisna. Each conquest wove a new thread into the growing tapestry of Hittite power. From this time forward, the name Labana became more than a man's name, it became a royal title, a mantle passed down by those who would rule Hatti. And the city he restored, Hattusa, would become the pulse of an empire, both fortress and sanctuary. Hattusa was unlike any city before it. Its walls, in time, would stretch for kilometers, following the contours of the hills, embracing both citadel and lower town. Great gates, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, would guard its entries, carved with beasts of power and guardians of stone. But in these early days, it was still raw, a place of smoke and hammer, of lumber hauled by oxen and stone blocks set by hand. The gods of the land, ancient and many, were given temples. The storm god, lord of sky and war, took pride of place. His consort, the sun goddess of Arina, watched over oaths and order. The people who called themselves Hittites, the Nesians in their own tongue, began to see themselves not just as one tribe among many, but as the stewards of something greater. A kingdom, yes, but also a realm of sacred duty and law. Thus was born the old kingdom of the Hittites, forged in the highlands, rooted in fire and faith. It would face many storms, within and without, but it now had a heart that would not easily cease to beat. The old kingdom, now rising from the stone terraces of Hattusa, did not rule by sheer will alone. Power, in the Hittite world, was never absolute. It moved like the mountain winds, strong, but always shaped by the contours of the land and the people. Though kings like Labana and his successors bore titles of majesty, they were bound, not unfettered. They stood at the center of a web of oaths, councils, and sacred traditions, all designed to keep order in a world where chaos always waited beyond the walls. At the heart of Hittite governance stood the king, Tabana in their language, both warrior and priest, judge and shepherd. He was the intermediary between gods and men, a mortal upon whom the heavens placed great responsibility. His authority came not from his bloodline alone, but from the gods' favor, declared through signs, omens, and the consent of the royal assembly. This assembly was known as the Panku. Unlike the divine kings of Egypt or the rigid castes of Babylon, the Hittite ruler sat not alone. The Panku was made up of nobles, priests, and high officials, those who had proven themselves in war and in council. They could advise the king, rebuke him, and in rare cases, judge him. From these gatherings emerged a delicate balance, kingship anchored not in tyranny, but in collective responsibility. It was in this spirit that one of the kingdom's most important texts was written, the Edict of Telepinu. This solemn document, carved not in boast but in warning, came from a later king weary of strife and bloodshed. Telepinu, seeking to preserve the realm, laid out rules of royal succession and justice. He wrote not in grandeur, but in caution. He told of past murders, betrayals, and the fall of mighty lineages. And he urged that power pass peacefully, from father to son, through sacred ritual and proper consent, not through the dagger. This legal-mindedness was not unusual. The Hittites were among the most law-conscious peoples of the ancient world. Their tablets record civil laws, codes of land ownership, penalties for theft, protections for slaves and wives. While some rules were harsh, many were surprisingly humane for their age. Slaves could marry freely. Women could own property. Punishments often came in silver fines rather than mutilation. There was cruelty, yes, but also an effort toward balance, a belief that justice was not vengeance, but order. Such was the early character of the Hittite realm, forged in the fire of war, but sustained by the steady hand of law. Its kings wore swords, but they also knelt before the gods and listened to their people. It was not perfection, no kingdom is, but it was a beginning. And it would be tested, in time, by forces both within and far beyond the mountain ring of Hattusa. As the sun climbed higher over Hattusa and the Old Kingdom gathered strength, dark clouds stirred beyond the forests to the north. There, among the dense woods and rugged hills of the Pontic Range, dwelled a people whom the Hittites never fully subdued, the Casca. They were not builders of cities. They left no tablets, raised no palaces, and carved no images into stone. To the Hittites, they seemed wild and rootless, moving in bands, living by the sword and the harvest. Yet they knew the hills like wolves, and their raids struck deep into the soft underbelly of empire. Again and again, they descended upon Hittite lands, burning fields, toppling outposts, and retreating before the chariots could arrive. The kings of Hattusa spoke of them with frustration, describing them as a plague, a storm sent by angry gods. And perhaps they were. For the Hittites, these northern raids were more than mere irritation. They weakened border garrisons, disrupted trade routes, and, worst of all, threatened the sanctity of Hattusa itself. More than once, the capital was abandoned, its people fleeing south while the forests vomited fire and fury. In these years, the unity of the Old Kingdom frayed. Lesser kings, once loyal vassals, began to act in defiance. The royal line faltered. Assassinations, coups, and sudden deaths marred the house of Labana. Power shifted uneasily between generals, nobles, and high priests. It was a time of disarray. The central authority in Hattusa grew weak. Kings rose and fell in rapid succession, and many would not even rule long enough to be remembered. The once proud heart of the Hittite world beat irregularly, thinned by internal rot and constant pressure from the untamed north. Yet the kingdom did not vanish. Its embers smoldered quietly in southern cities and among noble families who still remembered the old ways. The gods were not silent, and the land had not yet given up its sons. From this murk, this season of shadows and smoke, a resurgence would one day rise. A new dynasty. A new spirit. But first, the land would have to endure the darkness. And remember, out of the silence that followed the storms, the silence of fallen kings and shattered alliances, there came a renewal. Not sudden, not blinding like the dawn, but slow, deliberate, like green shoots rising from scorched earth. From the ashes of the old Hittite order rose a new house, one that would lead the kingdom out of its age of shadows, the house of Tadalia. We know little of the first Tadalia. The name would be borne by more than one king. He may have begun as a general, or a prince of noble blood. But what he possessed above all was vision, a sense that the kingdom could be made whole again. Under his guidance, Hattusa was reoccupied. The temples were re-sanctified, the walls rebuilt, and the sacred fires rekindled. The gods had not abandoned their people, it seemed, and neither had fate. Yet Tadalia's rule was not one of glory alone. The Casca remained ever present, gnawing at the northern borders. To the east, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni loomed, strong and cunning. To the west, Arzawa, a Luwian land rich in trade and ambition, tested Hittite resolve. The empire, though reborn, stood surrounded by wolves. Tadalia did not shy from these challenges. he knew that survival meant more than rebuilding cities. It required alliances, treaties, and if necessary, war. And so began a new phase of Hittite statecraft, diplomacy tempered by steel. From the eastern mountains came a new understanding with the Mitanni. Through treaties, carefully worded and sealed in divine oaths, peace was secured for a time. To the west, campaigns were launched to bring Arzawa into submission. Some cities fell by the sword, others by negotiation. And in the north, forts were raised, commanders stationed, and the Casca held, if not defeated, at bay. But Tidalia's greatest achievement may not have been his conquests. It was the reweaving of Hittite identity. He revived the royal cult, honored the old gods with renewed zeal, and claimed the legacy of Labana as his own. In doing so, he bound the new dynasty to the sacred traditions of the past. Under him, and his immediate successors, a new generation of scribes, warriors, and priests flourished. The archives of Hattusa grew thick with treaties, laws, and hymns. Temples buzzed with ritual, and the memory of old kings was not merely preserved, it was wielded as legitimacy. The House of Tidalia laid the true groundwork for empire. It was not yet the Hittite Golden Age, that would come with another, but the soil was now prepared. The roots had taken hold once more in the Anatolian highlands. The Hittite heart had begun to beat steadily again. The kings who followed Tidalia did not simply inherit a kingdom, they inherited the dream of an empire. That dream, fragile but persistent, would take form in the hands of kings who knew both diplomacy and war, who understood that power must be both claimed and sustained. It was during this period, beginning around the mid-15th century BC, that the Hittite realm transformed from a regional power into a true empire. No longer content to merely defend Hattusa and its surrounding provinces, the kings looked outward, to the west, south, and east, and sought to bring Anatolia, and lands beyond, under their command. Central to this imperial vision was the figure of the king, now elevated beyond tribal chief or warlord. He was the earthly embodiment of divine order, chosen by the gods, entrusted with the well-being of the land and its many peoples. His voice, inscribed in clay and sealed with royal insignia, carried the weight of law across vast territories. To maintain this expanding dominion, the Hittites developed a more structured administration. Provinces were governed by appointed officials, often royal relatives, who oversaw tribute, justice, and defense. These men answered directly to the great king and were expected to report regularly to Hattusa, where scribes recorded their words with meticulous care. Loyalty was ensured not just through force, but through the sacred bond of treaties. These agreements, written in precise language and sealed with oaths to the gods, bound vassal kings to the Hittite throne. Betrayal of such an oath was not just rebellion, it was sacrilege. Religion, too, played a central role in this expanding order. The Hittites, masters of integration, continued to absorb the deities of the lands they conquered. The result was a pantheon so vast it came to be called the Thousand Gods of Hatti. Each city, each province, had its own divine patrons, honored in elaborate festivals and temple rites. At the heart of this religious life stood the king himself, not a god, but a priest-king whose duties included leading processions, offering sacrifices, and ensuring cosmic balance. His authority rested as much on sacred ritual as on military might. The empire also grew in complexity through its military. The Hittite army, now highly organized, consisted of chariots, infantry, and auxiliary units drawn from vassal states. Great efforts were made to maintain readiness, weapons stored, horses bred, and scouts dispatched far beyond the borders. And with empire came the burden of its preservation. Threats multiplied, not only from the ever-troublesome Casca, but from rival empires like Egypt, Mitanni, and eventually Assyria. The Hittites would soon find themselves caught in a struggle for dominance over the ancient Near East. But in these early years of the empire period, there was confidence. The royal city of Hattusa stood secure behind its walls. The gods smiled upon their temples. The archives filled with records of victories, oaths, and offerings. For the first time, the Hittites looked upon themselves not as a kingdom of survivors, but as masters of a world forged in bronze, guided by the gods, and ordered by the hand of a king. To survive in the stormy world of the late Bronze Age was to master the art of war, not merely the clash of arms, but the management of men, resources, and movement across a landscape fraught with both peril and promise. The Hittites, shaped by centuries of conflict and surrounded by ambitious rivals, came to perfect this art with quiet intensity. Their armies were not the largest, nor their weapons the most advanced. But their discipline, organization, and adaptability made them a formidable force. At the heart of their strength stood the chariot. The Hittite chariot was not a mere symbol of nobility or pageantry. It was a weapon of war, fast and lethal. Unlike the lighter two-man chariots of Egypt, the Hittite model typically carried 3 men, a driver, a warrior, and a shield-bearer. This allowed greater flexibility in combat, one to steer, one to strike, and one to protect. On the flat plains and open fields of Anatolia and Syria, the Hittite chariot thundered like a storm. It could scatter infantry, harass enemy flanks, and deliver royal messengers with unmatched speed. Chariots were often decisive in battle, and the elite warriors who rode them were carefully trained and richly rewarded. But the strength of the Hittite army lay not only in the chariot's charge. It lay in the coordination of forces, infantry units marching behind, light skirmishers ready to harry the foe, and engineers to breach walls or defend narrow passes. War was not waged by glory alone, it was a science, a burden carried by logisticians, blacksmiths, and animal handlers as much as by kings. Hittite campaigns were long and often brutal. Marches stretched for hundreds of kilometers, through mountains, forests, and deserts. Provisions had to be managed with care, grain, fodder, water. Failure to plan meant ruin. Kings who failed in these duties could lose more than battles, they could lose the throne. The soldiers themselves came from across the empire, Hattians, Luwians, Hurrians, and vassal peoples alike. Though diverse in language and custom, they were bound by loyalty to the great king and the promise of plunder or land. Some were conscripted, others were part of a professional warrior caste, trained from youth. Before battle, omens were taken, the flight of birds, the entrails of animals, the words of oracles. The gods were consulted, for it was believed that every war was fought not only on earth, but in the heavens. A king who went to war without divine favor risked more than defeat, he risked cosmic disorder. Victory, when achieved, was announced in formal proclamations, inscribed in stone or clay. Captives were taken, cities looted, tribute demanded. But the Hittites were not merely destroyers. They often restored local rulers under Hittite suzerainty, so long as loyalty was pledged and tribute paid. Through war, the Hittites expanded. Through treaties, they maintained. And always, the wheel of the chariot turned, iron-rimmed, swift, and heavy with fate. In an age ruled by bronze, when kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of copper and tin, the Hittites possessed a secret that would one day change the balance of power: iron. The earth beneath Anatolia was rich not only in grain and stone, but in iron ore. Black and unyielding in its raw form, iron required greater heat and greater skill to shape than bronze. For centuries, it had been little more than a curiosity, used sparingly, in ceremonial blades or as offerings to the gods. But in time, the Hittites began to unlock its potential. The precise moment when they learned to forge iron tools with practical use remains debated. It is unlikely that they mass-produced iron weapons in the earliest days. Bronze was still more reliable, more easily worked, and better understood. But the Hittites, ever attentive to the knowledge of metalworkers and priests, began to explore its power. In small workshops, in the shadow of temples and near the mouths of mines, artisans experimented with fire and ore. These early smiths, often part of sacred guilds, passed their craft in whispers and ritual. To them, forging iron was not only metallurgy, it was communion with the underworld, with the deep forces of earth and flame. The knowledge was guarded. Inscriptions speak of iron blades gifted only to kings, of foreign envoys who came bearing gold in the hope of acquiring the precious, black metal. And though the Hittites did not yet rule the Iron Age, they had already stepped toward it, 1 foot in the old world, 1 foot in the new. Iron gave more than sharper swords. It offered prestige, a signal of divine favor and earthly might. Kings who possessed iron blades were seen as chosen, elevated above their bronze-bound peers. And though the full transformation would come only after the collapse of empires, the seed was already planted in Hattusa. Still, the Hittites did not yet abandon bronze. Their armies, their tools, their ornaments, all remained grounded in the older metal. But behind the palace walls, behind the smoke of the forges, the knowledge of iron was growing. In this subtle shift, quiet, slow, almost invisible, lay the beginning of a great turning. And though the kings of Hatti did not yet know it, the age of bronze was already breathing its last. In the center of every Hittite city, above the bustle of markets and the rumble of carts, rose the sacred precincts, temples walled with stone, roofed in timber, and perfumed with smoke. Here, the gods watched, listened, and judged. And here, the heart of the Hittite world beat not in gold or conquest, but in ritual. The Hittites were a deeply religious people. They did not serve a single god, nor even a fixed pantheon. Their empire embraced a bewildering multitude of deities, the 1,000 gods of Hatti, they called them. Each city, each mountain, each river, and even each household, had its own divine patrons. Some gods were old, born in the mists of the Hattian past. Others were Hurrian, Luwian, or even Babylonian, adopted and honored through alliance or conquest. The Hittites were not purists. They did not seek to suppress foreign gods, but to welcome them, to bind them into the fabric of empire. At the head of this divine host stood the storm god of Hatti, a powerful, warlike figure who controlled rain, thunder, and victory. His consort, the sun goddess of Arina, was a gentler force, the guardian of justice and order. Together, they represented the balance of chaos and law, of sky and earth, upon which the Hittite world depended. The king, though mortal, acted as the god's chosen servant. He led the great festivals, offered sacrifices, and spoke the prayers that bound the realm to divine favor. In times of drought or defeat, he alone bore the responsibility to restore balance through ritual. It was not a role of glory, but of burden. The temples themselves were complex and sacred spaces. Within their courtyards, priests performed rites of purification, poured libations, and prepared animals for sacrifice. In the inner chambers, where only the initiated might go, stood the divine images, not idols of gold, but often carved wood or stone, dressed in robes, fed with incense and wine. Outside, the festivals unfolded. Some lasted days, others weeks. Citizens and nobles gathered, music filled the streets, and processions carried sacred emblems through the gates of Hattusa. These rituals were more than celebrations, they were acts of cosmic renewal, preserving the order of the world. One of the most remarkable sanctuaries was Yazkaya, a sacred open-air shrine just beyond Hattusa's walls. Here, in the clefts of the rock, the gods were carved in long procession, stone figures of divine kings and queens, warriors and sages. They stood in silence, eternal and watchful, reminders of the divine presence in the landscape itself. The gods of Hatti were not remote. They were near, present in storm and harvest, in dreams and omens, in every oath sworn and every treaty sealed. And though the Hittites would one day fall, their gods, or the echoes of them, would linger in the stones, in the hills, and in the long memory of the land. There are moments in history when a single figure alters the course of a kingdom, when leadership, vision, and opportunity converge. For the Hittite Empire, that figure was Suppiluliuma. He did not inherit a throne in peace. The reign of his father, Tidaliya III, had been marred by defeat and humiliation. Arzawa in the west had grown bold. The Mitanni, traditional rivals in the east, had struck hard. Even Egypt had extended its shadow into northern Syria. The Hittite realm, though vast, was fraying at the edges. But Suppiluliuma, prince, general, and heir, was no passive observer. While still a young commander, he had fought beside his father, learning the arts of war and rule. When Tidaliya died, Suppiluliuma moved quickly. Some say he usurped the throne, others, that he was the only one strong enough to claim it. Either way, once crowned, he ruled with absolute resolve. His reign marked the high tide of Hittite power. First, he turned to the west. The land of Arzawa, long a thorn in Hatti's side, was broken in a series of campaigns. Cities surrendered. Vassal kings bowed. The Hittite banners flew from the Aegean shores to the mountain passes of Lydia. Then came the Mitanni. Once mighty, now weakened by Assyrian pressure and internal strife, they could not resist Suppiluliuma's advance. City by city, the eastern frontier was redrawn. Carchemish, Aleppo, and much of northern Syria fell under Hittite control. The empire now touched the edges of Mesopotamia, standing toe-to-toe with Babylon and Assyria. But it was in Syria that Suppiluliuma made his boldest moves. Here, nestled between rivers and trade routes, lay a prize contested by Egypt and Mitanni alike. With swift force and careful diplomacy, he seized it. He married his sons to local princesses, appointed loyal governors, and sealed alliances with oaths sworn before the gods. The world took notice. Even Egypt, proud and distant, felt the change. In one of the most extraordinary episodes of the ancient world, a letter came from the widow of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. She pleaded for a Hittite prince to come marry her, an unprecedented request. Suppiluliuma sent his son, Zenanza. But the prince never arrived. He was murdered en route, likely by Egyptian hands. The insult could not be ignored. Suppiluliuma invaded Egyptian-held lands in Syria. Battles followed. Cities burned. And while the full might of Egypt would respond in time, for now the Hittites held the ground. The empire had reached its greatest territorial extent. Hattusa stood at the heart of a domain stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Yet even in triumph, fate whispered warnings. A plague, brought back by soldiers returning from Syria, swept the land. Thousands died. Temples were shuttered. Even Suppiluliuma himself fell to the sickness. The king who had forged an empire died not in battle, but in fevered breath. His legacy, however, would endure. For he had not only expanded the Hittite world, he had redefined it. The empire Suppiluliuma left behind was mighty, but it was not at peace. His sons inherited a realm vast and restless, its frontiers under constant strain, its vassals ever watchful for weakness. And standing across the sands to the south, bold and unbending, was Egypt. It was only a matter of time before the two greatest powers of the Late Bronze Age would clash. That moment came under the reign of Muwatalli II, Suppiluliuma's son. A king of ambition and caution, Muwatalli understood the delicate balance between diplomacy and force. But he also understood that to hold Syria, the throat of empire, the Hittites would have to face Egypt not in words, but in war. The Egyptian pharaoh at the time was young Ramesses II, proud and fiery, eager to carve his name into stone and legend. His armies were vast, his chariots sleek, and his ambition boundless. He set his sights on Kadesh, a fortified city that guarded the Orontes River and stood as a linchpin of Hittite power in the region. In the 5th year of Ramesses' reign, war came. The Egyptians marched north in splendor, for great divisions crossing rivers and deserts beneath blazing banners. Ramesses believed he would catch the Hittites unaware. But Muwatalli was waiting, not in the city, but hidden beyond the hills, with a host of chariots and infantry from every corner of his realm. The battle that followed, the Battle of Kadesh, would become one of the most famous in all antiquity. It began with deception. Hittite scouts, posing as deserters, fed Ramesses false intelligence. Believing the enemy far away, the Egyptians advanced unguarded and were ambushed. The Hittite chariotry swept down upon them like a storm. The first Egyptian division was shattered. Panic spread. Only the pharaoh's personal valor and the desperate resistance of his bodyguard held the line. Rameses, in his inscriptions, would later claim divine inspiration and heroic strength. In truth, the battle was not a victory for either side. Though the Hittite ambush had nearly succeeded, their momentum faltered. Reinforcements arrived for Egypt, and Muwatalli chose not to press the attack. The field was littered with the wreckage of hundreds of chariots. The Orient ran thick with the blood of two empires. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. But the city had cost both sides dearly. The battle, though indecisive, marked the peak of Hittite-Egyptian rivalry, a contest not only of arms, but of prestige. In the years that followed, both powers withdrew to regroup. Raids and minor conflicts flared, but neither could fully dominate the other. And so, though thunder echoed over the plains of Syria, no storm would break the balance, not yet. For a new age of diplomacy was dawning, and soon, Hittite kings would set aside the sword for the scroll. Years passed after the clash at Kadesh, and with them passed the fiery illusions of total victory. Both Egypt and Hatti had tasted the cost of ambition. Though their armies remained ready, their lands required peace. The people hungered. The temples called. And the kings, grown older, began to listen. Thus unfolded one of the most remarkable acts in ancient statecraft, a peace not secured by conquest, but by pen and oath. It was a moment that stood apart in the storm-laden history of the Late Bronze Age, the Eternal Treaty. On one side stood Rameses II of Egypt, Lion of the Nile, builder of temples, shaper of monuments. On the other, Atuili III, the Hittite king who had risen not as crown prince, but as a usurper and reformer, brother to the former king and survivor of bitter civil strife. His reign began in uncertainty but matured into wisdom. Atuili was not a conqueror like Suppiluliuma, but a statesman. He had watched the costs of endless war, the fatigue of empires, the hunger of the gods gone unanswered. He knew that strength could also lie in restraint. The Treaty of Kadesh, as it is often called, was signed around 1259 BCE. But it was more than a truce. It was a detailed and mutual accord, inscribed in both Hittite and Egyptian script, guaranteeing peace, alliance, and mutual defense. The two kings pledged not to attack one another, to return fugitives who fled across their borders, and to come to each other's aid if threatened by external enemies. The gods of both realms were invoked as witnesses, Ra and Seth, the storm god and sun goddess. Violating the treaty would mean not only political shame, but divine wrath. It was an unprecedented moment. Copies of the treaty were exchanged, one in Hattusa, one in Thebes. Today, one hangs in the United Nations, a silent testimony from an age when kings wrote not only in blood, but in understanding. The treaty did not erase rivalry, but it brought breathing space. Trade resumed. Royal envoys journeyed between capitals bearing gifts and letters. One of Atuili's daughters even married Rameses, a Hittite princess becoming queen of Egypt. These exchanges, preserved in clay and stone, reveal not just politics, but human voices of pride, fatigue, hope. In one letter, Attuili chides Rameses for delays in correspondence. In another, they speak almost as equals, discussing health, family, and loyalty. Thus, the warrior empires of bronze found a moment of silver, a reflection of what was possible when ambition gave way to wisdom. It would not last forever. But for a time, peace ruled where chariots once thundered. And the kings of Hatti and Egypt, once foes on the plains of Kadesh, became stewards of a fragile and luminous accord. Beyond the sword and the shrine, another power shaped the Hittite Empire, quieter, steadier, yet no less essential. It was the power of the pen. In the royal city of Hattusa, within stone buildings whose walls were lined with shelves, the scribes of Hatti worked in silence. Bent over clay tablets, they pressed the cuneiform signs of empire, treaties, laws, decrees, prayers, omens, and letters. Their tools were styluses, their ink was mud, and their legacy was memory itself. The Hittites were heirs to a rich tradition of writing, drawn from their Assyrian neighbors and shaped into their own. They wrote in multiple tongues, Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, and others, choosing the language to fit the message. Treaties with Egypt were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. Royal decrees were carved in Hittite. Ritual texts often bore the mark of older, sacred languages. At the heart of this literary world stood the scribal schools, institutions closely tied to temples and the palace. Young men, often sons of elite families, were trained in the thousands of symbols required to master cuneiform. They learned not only writing, but law, religion, and the ancient histories of kings. Once trained, these scribes formed the nervous system of the empire. It was they who recorded tax levies, land grants, court rulings. They copied myths and rituals to ensure the favor of the gods. They corresponded with governors across the realm, their words sealed with the royal stamp. Each tablet bore more than text. It bore authority, marked by seal impressions, symbols of rank and identity. The seals were small, but heavy with meaning. A cylinder rolled across wet clay left a signature more permanent than ink, the name of a prince, a high priest, or the great king himself. The royal archives at Hattusa, uncovered millennia later beneath layers of earth and ash, held thousands of these tablets. Among them were military reports, ritual instructions, weather records, diplomatic letters, even collections of omens used to divine the future. It was a record not just of rule, but of a world view. For the Hittites believed that words could bind fate. An oath written and sealed was more than law, it was sacred. A prayer misspoken could offend a god. A treaty broken could unravel the order of heaven and earth. And so, amid the flicker of oil lamps, the scribes worked, keepers of memory, guardians of law, witnesses to the life of a civilization. They left no temples. They won no battles. But through their hands, the empire of the Hittites was given form, voice, and time. Long after the kings were gone, their words remained, pressed into clay, buried in silence, waiting to be read once more. No empire, no matter how vast or wise, is beyond the reach of unseen forces. The Hittites had conquered cities, forged treaties, and pleased their many gods with sacrifices and prayer. Yet in the midst of their greatest strength, a shadow passed over the land, silent, invisible, and merciless. It came not with armies, but with breath. A sickness. The plague, which struck during the reign of Suppiluliuma and lingered into the reigns of his sons, swept across the Hittite world with a force no sword could turn. Brought back, it seems, by returning soldiers from campaigns in Syria, or perhaps by captives taken from Egyptian territories, the disease spread quickly through towns and villages, striking both lowborn and royal alike. Hattusa, the seat of empire, was not spared. Temples were closed, processions halted, the palace subdued. Prayers rose to the heavens with growing urgency. Priests searched for omens, for missed rituals, for forgotten gods who might be angered. For the Hittites, illness was never random, it was a sign, a judgment, a breach in the sacred balance. King Mursili II, son of Suppiluliuma, inherited not only the crown but the crisis. A young man when he ascended the throne, he carried the weight of plague, rebellion, and divine silence. His writings, preserved on clay tablets, speak of a ruler both pious and burdened. Again and again, he sought to understand why the gods were angry. "I have offered to all the gods," he writes in a prayer. "I have fed them, I have given them their festivals. Still, the plague does not leave the land." This was not merely a medical crisis. It was a spiritual one. The Hittite worldview saw kingship as a divine responsibility. A failure of health in the kingdom was a failure of the king's duty before the gods. Mursili, though young, proved resilient. He continued his father's wars, suppressed revolts, and stabilized the empire. But always the plague lingered, a quiet reminder of human frailty. Years passed. Still it clung to the land. The royal family suffered. High officials died. The population dwindled. And though the empire did not fall, not yet, it was weakened. From this era, we inherit not only prayers and medical rituals, but a sense of fear, of being watched by forces greater than kings. For the Hittites, plague was not a random act of nature. It was a conversation between man and God gone wrong. And so, even in the shadow of temples and the triumphs of chariots, the people of Hatti looked skyward, hoping for a sign, not of conquest, but of forgiveness. The Hittite Empire had endured wars, plagues, and rebellions. It had bent but not broken. Yet in its final century, the signs of strain grew harder to ignore. The walls of Hattusa still stood strong, the scribes still wrote, the temples still rang with hymns, but beneath the order, cracks widened. The later kings, Kurunta, Tudalia IV, Suppiluliuma II, were not weak men. They fought to hold what had been won, to preserve the legacy of Suppiluliuma and Hattusili. They rebuilt cities, sent envoys abroad, and maintained rituals with tireless devotion. But the world around them had changed. To the west, Mycenaean warriors grew bold, their ships haunting the shores of Anatolia. To the east, Assyria stirred with growing ambition. And along the empire's northern rim, the Casca remained a constant thorn, ever raiding, never tamed. Even within the empire, loyalty frayed. Vassal kingdoms in Syria grew restless. Communications broke down. Climate shifts may have dried rivers and shortened harvests. Famines began to bite. The great festivals, so vital to cosmic order, were harder to carry out. Grain had to be rationed. Sacred processions were postponed. Tadalia IV, a conscientious and capable ruler, tried to stem the tide. He issued new laws, regulated irrigation, rebuilt the temple of the storm god at Yazkiah. He oversaw the last of the great Hittite building projects and sought to renew the empire's spirit through piety and reform. But his reign marked not a rebirth, but a holding action. His successor, Suppiluliuma II, would be the last king of Hatti. His reign began with fire and fury, a naval expedition against pirates, campaigns to secure Cyprus, letters exchanged with distant kingdoms. He fought with the vigor of a king who knew he was guarding the edge of a collapsing world. The archives of Hattusa, still rich in correspondence and treaties, grow quiet near the end. The last tablets speak not of expansion, but of desperation, requests for grain, warnings of rebellion, pleas for stability. There were no grand defeats. No final battle written in blood and stone. Instead, the empire faded like a sunset, slow, golden, and then gone. One day, the scribes stopped writing. The temples grew cold. The gates of Hattusa stood open, the walls unmanned. And the kingdom that had once shaken the world with its chariots and laws, its gods and kings, passed into silence. The fall of the Hittite Empire did not occur in isolation. Across the ancient world, in a chain of lands stretching from Greece to Mesopotamia, kingdoms crumbled, cities burned, and written voices fell silent. This was the great unraveling known to modern scholars as the Late Bronze Age collapse. And in its stormy center stood the Sea Peoples. Who they were, no one can say for certain. They left no writing, no temples, no royal tombs. Only the scars of their passage remain, in the ruins of cities, in the desperate letters of dying kings, and in the battle reliefs carved on Egyptian temple walls. They came in waves, warriors, settlers, exiles, sweeping over the Mediterranean in ships both feared and nameless. To the Hittites, already weakened by famine, rebellion, and internal strain, this invasion was the final blow. From the western coastlines of Anatolia, the Sea Peoples descended. They razed cities, disrupted trade, and sent waves of displaced peoples inland. The Hittite frontier, once held firm by garrisons and treaties, began to dissolve. Vassals in Syria declared independence or were conquered. The vital artery of grain and copper that sustained Hattusa was severed. There is no single tablet that describes the fall. No last cry in stone. But from the silence that follows, we understand. Hattusa, once teeming with priests, scribes, and soldiers, was abandoned. Its palaces were emptied. The libraries, vast, meticulous, were buried in ash and dust. Not destroyed in battle, it seems, but slowly choked by neglect and fear. Other cities followed. Ugarit sent letters pleading for aid that never came. Mycenae burned. Troy fell into ruin. Across the eastern Mediterranean, order crumbled. Only Egypt, bruised but enduring under Ramesses III, held the tide, and even then, barely. The age of great kings, chariot armies, and delicate diplomatic letters had ended. In its place came a long silence, a dark interlude where writing ceased, trade vanished, and the old gods stood watch over empty cities. But amid the wreckage, something new would stir. New peoples. New tongues. And from the forgotten tablets of Hattusa, buried deep beneath the earth, the memory of the Hittites would one day awaken once more. Though the heart of the Hittite Empire had fallen silent, its voice did not vanish entirely. Far from the cold stones of abandoned Hattusa, scattered across the warm hills and valleys of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, small kingdoms endured, heirs to Hatti in name, language, and custom. These were the Syro-Hittite states, born from the fragments of empire. Carchemish, once a key Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates, now became a kingdom in its own right. It retained the traditions of the old order, kingship, court ceremony, the worship of Hittite gods. Royal inscriptions still praised the storm god and remembered Suppiluliuma as a divine ancestor. To the west, in places like Melid, Kuma, and Gergum, similar principalities took root. Each had its own local identity, yet all bore the imprint of Hittite governance. They used the same hieroglyphic script, preserved Hittite legal traditions, and carved their history in stone with the same royal formulas. These new kingdoms were smaller, more vulnerable, yet they carried something precious: continuity. They kept alive the language of power, the names of gods, the memory of the kings of Hattusa. In this way, the Hittite legacy did not disappear, it diffused. The world they inhabited was no longer the grand chessboard of Bronze Age diplomacy, but a fractured landscape of tribal confederations, rising Assyrian might, and local rivalries. Yet in this new world, the Syro-Hittite kingdoms adapted. They traded with Phoenicians, negotiated with Arameans, and watched warily as Assyria moved westward. Some paid tribute, others resisted. Their cities were smaller than Hattusa, but their walls were strong, their temples still active. They carved magnificent reliefs, processions of gods, kings in prayer, warriors in triumph, on stone gates and city walls. The hieroglyphic Luwian script, used by their scribes, bore resemblance to the language of their ancestors, though it had grown distinct. And though these kingdoms never reclaimed the glory of the empire, they offered a bridge between worlds. A bridge from bronze to iron, from Hattusa to Nineveh, from forgotten empires to remembered names. In time, they too would fall, to the rising power of Assyria, to internal decay, to shifting trade winds. But for centuries after Hattusa's fall, the flame of Hittite culture flickered still. A whisper in stone. A name on a tablet. A god remembered in prayer. Language is the soul of a civilization. It shapes how people see the world, how they name their gods, record their laws, remember their dead. For the Hittites, that language was Nesali, the language of Nesha, the voice once pressed into tablets in the royal halls of Hattusa. With the fall of the empire, Nesali began to fade. In the Syro-Hittite kingdoms, it was no longer spoken in daily life. The language of court and temple gradually shifted toward Luwian, a sister tongue, more widely understood in the south. The old scribes, once the keepers of state, grew fewer. Their tablets remain buried in broken archives, unread and abandoned. And with them, the language slipped into silence. The Luwian hieroglyphs carved into walls and gates kept some echo of Hittite syntax. But Nestle itself, the language of treaties, royal decrees, and epic prayers, passed from use. Unlike Greek or Akkadian, it left no living descendants. No one sang in it or wrote poems in its rhythms. It became a sealed language, waiting beneath the earth. It would take over 3,000 years before that seal was broken. In the early 20th century, amid the ruins of Hattusa, thousands of clay tablets were unearthed. Scholars, staring at the cuneiform signs, at first believed them to be Akkadian, the international tongue of the Bronze Age. But something was strange. The grammar was different. The verbs unfamiliar. A mystery. Then, in 1915, a Czech linguist named Bedtime Rosny made a quiet discovery that would echo across the field of ancient studies. He translated a single line, Nindran ezateni, Watamar ekateni, you will eat bread and drink water. Simple words, yet they unlocked the door. He had found an Indo-European language, written in cuneiform, buried in Anatolia. Nestle, the Hittite language, was no longer silent. With time, scholars came to see it not only as Indo-European, but as the oldest attested member of that great language family. Older than Latin, older than Sanskrit, older even than Greek. Its words had once shaped an empire. Now they shaped understanding. The rediscovery of Nestle allowed historians to read the prayers of Mercilli, the laws of Telepinu, the treaties of Suppiluliuma. The voices of kings and scribes, once thought lost, spoke again, not in grandeur, but in clarity. And through their language, we came to know not only what the Hittites did, but who they were. They called themselves the people of Hatti. They spoke the tongue of Nesha. And though time buried their cities, it could not bury their words forever. For centuries, Hattusa lay forgotten beneath wind and grass, its mighty gates crumbled, its temples buried beneath centuries of silence. Shepherds wandered across its hills unaware that beneath their feet had once walked kings and priests, warriors and scribes. Time had erased the name. The Greeks and Romans knew nothing of the Hittites. The Bible preserved only distant echoes, the Hittites mentioned among Canaanite tribes, likely referring to later descendants. In the maps of the ancient world, Hatti had vanished. But the stones remembered. In the 19th century, as explorers and archaeologists began to probe the ruins of the Near East, strange inscriptions were found in Anatolia, carvings in a script no one could read, showing processions of gods and kings unlike those of Mesopotamia or Egypt. The style was bold, unfamiliar, yet regal. A forgotten civilization lay beneath the dust. In the early 20th century, a German archaeological team led by Hugo Winkler began excavations at a site called Bozköy in central Turkey. What they found was astonishing: a vast city, with thick stone walls, monumental gates guarded by lions and sphinxes, and hundreds upon hundreds of clay tablets. They had found Hattusa. As the tablets were studied, it became clear this was no provincial town, but the capital of a great empire. The texts bore royal seals, treaty formulas, and references to foreign kings, including pharaohs of Egypt. The Hittite Empire, long lost to history, had been rediscovered. Among the greatest finds were the royal archives, entire rooms lined with cuneiform tablets. Letters from foreign courts, records of festivals, laws, oracles, and prayers. It was a window into a world not glimpsed in 3,000 years. The site of Hattusa was gradually mapped. Its double walls were traced, its temples and palaces uncovered. Nearby, the sanctuary of Yazkiah was revealed, its stone gods still standing, watching silently as they had for millennia. Today, Hattusa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The gates have been partially restored. The tablets are housed in museums across the world. And through them, the Hittites, long silent, speak again. They tell us of gods and kings, of law and ritual, of fear and faith. But more than that, they remind us that no civilization, once given voice in stone or clay, is ever truly lost. The winds may bury, the forests may grow, but the earth remembers. And in its remembering, so do we. In the halls of Hattusa and the valleys beyond, the Hittites honored not one god, nor 10, but thousands. Their empire was not bound by a single faith, but by a vast, living tapestry of divine names and sacred duties. This pantheon, immense, layered, and ever-growing, came to be known as the 1,000 Gods of Hatti. The number was not precise. It was a symbol of inclusion. Every city, every mountain, every river had its guardian. The Hittites, more than conquerors, were collectors of gods. From the Hattians, they took the storm god of the sky and the earth. From the Hurrians, they absorbed the deities of wisdom, healing, and the dark underworld. From the Luwians came sun gods, war gods, and mysterious spirits of nature. Each new territory added to the sacred choir. Yet there was no violent erasure. The old gods were not banished, they were welcomed, given temples, invoked by priests. In this fusion, the Hittite religion became a mirror of the empire itself, diverse, ordered, and rooted in tradition. At the head of the divine order stood the storm god of Hatti, mighty in war, master of weather, consort to the sun goddess of Arina. He was not distant. His voice was found in thunder, his anger in drought, his blessing in rain. His image stood tall in stone, his name written in treaties and oaths. The sun goddess, for her part, was more than a figure of light. She ruled over truth and order, the divine counterpart to the king's justice. Together, they upheld the moral structure of the world, as king and queen did on earth. Ritual was the lifeblood of this belief. Every day, in hundreds of temples, priests performed offerings, grain, wine, incense, and animals, to keep the balance between mortal and divine. Festivals marked the turning of seasons, the planting of crops, the victory in battle. At their heart was not joy alone, but duty. In sacred texts, God spoke in dreams and omens. They demanded respect, reminded kings of forgotten promises, punished with famine or plague. A good ruler was not only a warrior or judge, but a servant of the gods, performing rites, restoring temples, listening to the whispers of the divine. Even treaties invoked divine witnesses. Oaths were sealed not just before men, but before gods. To break a treaty was to invite the fury of heaven. And yet, Hittite religion was not static. It evolved. It borrowed. It changed with time. It reflected the realities of empire, the need to unify, the willingness to absorb, the reverence for ancient names. When the empire fell, many of its gods did not vanish. They were remembered under new forms by the peoples who came after, Luwians, Arameans, even Greeks and Persians. The storm god became Tar-Hunt, then Zeus. The sun goddess, a shadow in later myths of Anatolia. Their temples turned to dust. Their names faded from speech. But in the carvings of Yazkiah and the tablets of Hattusa, the 1,000 gods of Hatti still walk, in silence, in stone, in story. Within the palaces of Hattusa, behind walls of carved stone and beneath the gaze of gods, moved women whose presence shaped the life of the empire. Though the Hittite world was often ruled by men, kings, generals, priests, it did not silence its queens. In truth, few ancient civilizations gave such formal recognition to royal women. The title they bore was not ornamental. The Tawananna, queen of the Hittites, was more than a consort. She was high priestess of the realm, keeper of sacred rites, and, in some cases, a figure of independent authority. The role of Tawananna was lifelong. Once crowned, a queen retained her title even after the king's death. No new Tawananna could be appointed until the former passed, a tradition that sometimes led to tension between generations of royal women and new kings seeking to elevate their own wives. These queens presided over rituals, maintained temple staffs, and participated in the vast religious festivals of the empire. In times of war, they could act as regents. In times of peace, they managed the inner court and sometimes issued royal edicts. Their names were recorded, their seal impressions found beside those of kings. One of the most prominent was Puduhipa, queen and priestess, wife of Atuili III. Born in the kingdom of Kitsuwatna, she was steeped in Hurrian religious tradition. Her marriage to Atuili was not merely personal, it was symbolic of cultural fusion, uniting the empire's central and southern identities. Puduhipa's influence was remarkable. She corresponded with Rameses II of Egypt, negotiating terms, sending gifts, maintaining royal ties. Her letters, preserved in the archives, reveal a voice confident and diplomatic. She even addressed foreign queens as equals, discussing alliances and divine favor. As Tawananna, she reorganized temple hierarchies, intervened in legal cases, and ensured that ritual obligations were met across the empire. Her seal appears on treaties, priestly appointments, and royal decisions. She was not a shadow behind the throne, she sat beside it, her presence known in every corner of the kingdom. But beyond the palace, Hittite women occupied varied roles. In society, they could own property, initiate divorce, and serve in temples. Laws protected their rights, outlined inheritance, and recognized their roles in both rural and urban life. While the world remained patriarchal, it was not closed. In the households of farmers, in the workshops of artisans, in the sacred precincts of shrines, Hittite women worked, prayed, and shaped their families' fates. They spun wool, baked bread, raised children, and honored the gods, often the goddesses, who guarded hearth and field. In the grand and in the humble, their lives were woven into the empire's fabric. And though their statues rarely stand, and their names are fewer on stone, their influence is felt, in law, in ritual, in the enduring memory of queens like Pudu-Hepa, whose words still speak after 3,000 years. Empires are remembered for their kings, their battles, and their gods. But beneath the marble of palaces and the stone of temples, there lived the people, those who plowed the fields, baked the bread, raised the walls, and bore the burdens of peace and war alike. In the Hittite lands, daily life unfolded with rhythm and care. From the sunlit farms of the Harles River Valley to the bustling quarters of Hattusa, men and women lived by the seasons, the harvest, and the call of the king. The majority were farmers. They tended wheat, barley, lentils, staples of survival, and cared for flocks of sheep and goats. The soil, though not as fertile as the Nile or Mesopotamia's riverbanks, yielded enough when rains were kind. In years of drought, grain was rationed by royal decree, stored in great silos near the capital. Farming was both labor and ritual. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were accompanied by prayers and offerings, lest the storm god withhold his blessing. Even simple acts had sacred meaning. In towns, artisans shaped the materials of empire. Potters spun their wheels beside hearths, bronzesmiths hammered tools and weapons, and weavers crafted garments of wool and linen. Woodworkers built carts and furniture, masons laid stone with surprising precision. Trade connected them to distant places, copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, lapis and ivory from lands beyond their borders. Homes were modest, mud brick walls, thatched or wooden roofs, small hearths for cooking. Extended families lived under one roof, sharing work and meals. Bread was a staple, often served with pulses, vegetables, and, when possible, meat or cheese. Beer was brewed. Wine, though less common, was prized by nobles. The society was tiered. At the top stood the royal family and nobility, landholders, generals, priests. Below them, scribes and officials managed law and order. Farmers, artisans, and merchants formed the broad base. Slaves existed, though many were debt-bound or prisoners of war, and some could gain freedom through service. Children were taught by elders, boys trained in farming, crafting, or military duties, girls in household tasks and religious rites. In wealthier homes, children of officials might learn writing, perhaps even attend the scribal schools of Hattusa. Justice was handled locally, with laws recorded in royal edicts. Many crimes were settled with fines rather than mutilation, a sign of practical governance. Women had legal standing, they could inherit land, bring suits, and manage households. Marriage was formalized with contracts, divorce, while rare, was permitted. Religion shaped every layer of life. Shrines stood in homes. Gods were invoked at meals, in illness, in childbirth. Festivals drew entire communities together, singing, dancing, processions. The sacred was never far from the ordinary. Though their names were not written in the royal annals, these people, the farmers, weavers, soldiers, herders, were the breath of Hatti. Their labor built its cities. Their taxes filled its storehouses. Their prayers rose like incense to the 1,000 gods. And when the empire fell, it was their memory that lingered longest, not in clay or stone, but in the unbroken lines of those who continued to live upon the same land, under the same sky. The strength of an empire is measured not only in arms, but in how it moves goods, messages, people, and ideas. Across the dusty paths and mountain passes of the Hittite realm stretched a vast network of roads and routes, winding through valleys, crossing rivers, and linking capital to province, temple to village, king to vassal. These were not roads of stone like those the Romans would build in later centuries, but they were organized and maintained with care. Merchants, envoys, military units, and supply trains all used them, their journeys sanctioned and sometimes protected by the royal court. Caravans moved slowly, oxen-drawn carts and pack animals bearing goods from one city to another. Along these roads came copper from the Taurus Mountains, tin from the east, silver from the western hills, and wool and cloth from every household loom. The goods flowed in two directions, tribute from vassals to the great king, and luxury items sent as gifts or in trade to foreign courts. In the marketplace of Hattusa, foreign wares could be found, spices, lapis lazuli, fine linens. Phoenician merchants brought dyes and oils. Hurrian craftsmen offered intricately worked metal objects. Trade reached as far as Babylon and Egypt, and treaties often included clauses about safe passage and the exchange of envoys and merchants. The palace economy was highly centralized. Royal granaries stored grain not only for famine relief, but as state wealth. The king controlled large herds of livestock, vineyards, and orchards. Artisans worked in palace workshops, producing chariots, weapons, ceremonial vessels, and textiles for both domestic use and foreign exchange. Tribute from vassal states formed a regular stream: cattle, metals, slaves, and crafted goods. Each year, envoys from cities in Syria and Anatolia would arrive bearing gifts and oaths, reaffirming their loyalty. Their presence in Hattusa was part politics, part ritual, and wholly essential to the image of imperial unity. Trade was also sacred. It was watched by gods and protected by oaths. Royal letters speak of merchants who were detained or harmed abroad. Such offenses could spark conflict. A merchant's caravan carried not just cargo, but the face of the empire itself. Tolls and taxes funded infrastructure and royal expense. Roads were kept passable, way stations were built, and scribes recorded every movement. The administration was meticulous, tracking the flow of grain and silver, and documenting disputes over trade with remarkable clarity. This flow of goods also brought ideas, religious rites, foreign words, musical instruments, and even writing systems. The Hittites adopted the Akkadian script for diplomacy, the Hurrian myths for ritual, and perhaps even the knowledge of iron through these very roots. But when the empire collapsed, so too did its arteries. Roads fell into disuse. Markets emptied. Long-distance trade all but vanished for centuries. Cities that once hummed with commerce faded into ghostly silence. Yet in their time, these roads tied together a land as vast and varied as the empire itself. They were the veins of Hatti, pulsing with tribute, trade, and trust, carrying not just wealth, but the lifeblood of civilization. In the highlands of central Anatolia, where winters bite and summers glare, the Hittites raised a city from the rock, not to dazzle, but to endure. Hattusa, their capital, was not built to please the eye in marble or gold. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a declaration of order in a world ruled by gods and threatened by chaos. Its walls, shaped from stone and earth, stretched for over 6 kilometers, winding across ridges and enclosing the heart of empire. Gates were placed with precision, each not only a defense but a symbol: the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate. These were not merely entry points, they were thresholds between the mundane and the sacred, watched by carved beasts whose silent gaze defied time. Within the walls lay a city of districts, the royal acropolis, the temple quarter, residential areas, storehouses, and stables. The great temple, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess of Arina, stood at the city's sacred center. Its courts and chambers were wide and cool, paved in stone, the walls lined with ritual vessels and divine statues dressed in cloth and crowned with gold. Beyond the temple stood palaces and administrative halls, places not of beauty, but of authority. Their walls were plain, yet their foundations were deep. Beneath many buildings lay tunnels and grain silos, designed to protect and preserve in times of siege or drought. Yet Hattusa was more than city, it was a map of power. The very layout reflected hierarchy: temples nearest the palace, officials nearest the gates, and further beyond, the homes of artisans and workers. Every brick was placed with purpose. The city breathed the rhythms of both law and liturgy. Even the rock itself was sacred. Just outside the city walls stood Yazkaya, that inscribed rock. There, in 2 natural chambers carved into the hillside, the Hittites etched a procession of gods, 37 deities in one chamber, 38 in the other. They march in profile, divine lords of storm, earth, sky, and shadow, meeting at the center in solemn embrace. It was not a temple in the usual sense. No roof sheltered the gods. The sky itself was their ceiling, and the rock was their altar. Here, rituals of kingship and renewal were likely performed. Some believe Yazkaya symbolized the underworld, the cycle of death and rebirth. Others see it as a cosmic assembly, mirroring the empire's vast pantheon. Throughout the land, similar patterns emerged. Fortified cities with central temples, grain storage, ritual spaces, and administrative buildings. The Hittites were not innovators in style, but masters of integration. They built with the land, not upon it, blending practicality with spiritual presence. And though their buildings were humble beside the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Babylon, they endured. Stones of Hattusa still stand. Gateways still open into ancient streets. Carvings still whisper of gods and kings who once ruled a world of bronze and storm. The architecture of the Hittites was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to last, and it has. Beneath the storm gods and above the common man, between the chariot and the plough, lay a force that held the Hittite world together: law. In an age when might often made right, the Hittites stood apart. Their kings, though powerful, were not above judgment. Their scribes, though loyal, recorded more than conquest. They wrote codes, lines pressed into clay not with pride, but with purpose. Law, for the Hittites, was not merely command. It was memory, morality, and the backbone of civilization. One of the most remarkable features of the Hittite state was its legal tradition, vast, detailed, and humane by the standards of the time. Preserved on tablets found in Hattusa, Hittite laws covered everything from theft and injury to marriage, property, farming, and ritual obligations. They were not framed as decrees from the gods, nor as abstract philosophy. They were practical, shaped by experience, aimed at resolving disputes and preserving social order. Many punishments took the form not of death or mutilation, but of compensation. A thief might pay back what he stole, with interest. An injury might be repaid in silver. Even serious crimes, such as manslaughter or adultery, often resulted in fines, exile, or restitution, not execution. The principle was balance. Harmony. Where other cultures demanded blood, the Hittites sought repair. The Edict of Telepinu, composed by a king in a time of civil strife, stands as a moral and political charter. In it, Telepinu laments the chaos brought by murder and ambition. He outlines how succession must proceed, clearly, peacefully, to prevent the kingdom from descending into civil war. His voice is not that of a tyrant, but of a weary guardian trying to preserve the realm. Legal protections extended even to slaves, women, and foreigners. Slaves could marry freely and purchase their freedom. Women could inherit property and bring legal cases. Foreigners living in Hittite lands were protected by treaties and often allowed to live under their own laws, so long as they paid tribute and swore loyalty. The courts were local, presided over by judges and overseen by the king's appointees. Testimonies were gathered, evidence reviewed, and verdicts inscribed for record. Oaths played a central role. To lie under oath was not only perjury, but sacrilege. Justice, too, had its sacred side. Before major decisions, omens might be read. The will of the gods was sought through the liver of a sacrificed animal, the flight of birds, or the pattern of smoke. The legal and the divine were never far apart. A law unblessed could bring ruin, a just decision, divinely affirmed, brought peace. And so, amid the stone and storm of empire, the Hittites built something rare, a society bound not only by power, but by principle. Their laws, firm, flexible, and wise, echo not only in the tablets they left behind, but in the very idea of justice they tried to uphold, not as vengeance, but as balance. To rule the Hittite Empire was to walk a path both mortal and divine. The king was no god, but he stood perilously close to their realm, but chosen intermediary, a shepherd of his people, and a servant of the heavens. His crown was not merely a sign of power, but of burden. The Hittite king, Tabana in the native tongue, bore many faces. He was a warrior in times of war, a priest in times of peace, and always a guardian of order. His role was shaped by duty, not grandeur. He did not rule by divine right alone, but by the careful observance of law, ritual, and justice. From his coronation onward, a king was bound by sacred acts. He was purified with fire and water, clothed in garments embroidered with symbols of the gods, and led through the holy gates of Hattusa to be seated upon the throne. The gods were present, invoked in prayer, invited in image, watching from the stones of temple and sky. In festival, the king danced and sang before the gods. In temple, he offered libations and recited ancient hymns. In court, he judged disputes with a steady hand and a listening heart. His every action echoed beyond the realm of men, for if the king failed in his duties, the land might fail with him. Plague, famine, defeat in war, all were seen as signs of royal neglect or divine displeasure. Thus, the king was watched not only by his people, but by heaven. And he did not rule alone. Beside him stood the queen, the Tawananna, often a high priestess in her own right. She shared in ritual, in correspondence with foreign powers, and sometimes in the governance of the realm. Together, they formed a sacred partnership, reflecting the harmony of the storm god and the sun goddess who ruled the heavens. Yet even the king's authority had limits. The Panku, the royal council, could advise, admonish, and even, in earlier centuries, challenge royal decisions. This early memory of collective rule remained in the rituals and legal structures of empire, a quiet restraint upon the throne. When a king died, he was not merely buried. He was transformed. In the Hittite tradition, kings became gods, ancestors elevated to the divine court. Their spirits were honored in temple rites, invoked in treaties, and remembered in stone inscriptions. This was not vanity. It was continuity. The king, in death, joined those who had gone before, Labana, Hattusili, Sapeluliyuma, not as conquerors alone, but as caretakers of a realm where man and God walked side by side. To be king in Hatti was to live always beneath the gaze of eternity. Each word a record. Each gesture a prayer. Each breath a thread in the delicate weave of heaven and earth. The Hittite world was not defined solely by cities or borders. It was shaped by the land, a landscape alive with presence and meaning. Mountains, rivers, forests, and caves were more than features of nature. They were holy. They breathed with the spirits of gods and ancestors. To the Hittites, geography was theology. Each mountain had a name, a god, a story. They stood as pillars between heaven and earth, places where the divine might speak or descend. Kings offered sacrifices upon their slopes, especially before campaigns or during sacred festivals. The gods of the mountain were believed to grant strength, fertility, and protection, but they could also withhold. The Caspian hills to the north were feared as wild and godless. The Taurus mountains to the south were revered, especially in the land of Kitsuwatna, where the storm god of the mountain reigned supreme. These peaks, often veiled in storm and mist, formed the spiritual spine of the empire. Rivers, too, held power. The Harlis River, which curved in a great arc around Hattusa, was more than water. It was a lifeline, a guardian, a witness to the empire's rise. Rituals were performed upon its banks, and its crossings marked the movement of armies, envoys, and kings. Sacred springs dotted the land, sites of pilgrimage and prayer. Some were said to heal, others to reveal omens. Priests would read the flow of water, the behavior of birds nearby, the ripple of leaves, seeking divine messages in every motion. Even caves were not mere hollows in the earth. Some were considered entrances to the underworld, places of death, yes, but also of transformation. Rites of passage, initiation, or burial might be held near these shadowed realms, invoking deities of darkness and renewal. Among the most remarkable expressions of sacred geography was Yazkaya, the inscribed rock. There, outside the walls of Hattusa, the gods were carved into living stone. Processions of divine figures walked the cliffs, their faces worn but still visible, their presence eternal. Here, the entire pantheon seemed to gather: storm gods, sun gods, goddesses of grain and battle, spirits of ancestors and kings. They marched toward one another, meeting in divine union, a cosmic ceremony etched in silence. It was likely here that the New Year's festival was observed, a ritual of death and rebirth, in which the king reaffirmed his bond to the gods and the land. The landscape itself became a participant in the rite. The Hittites did not worship their gods from afar. They met them in valleys and crags, on mountaintops and riverbanks, where wind and earth mingled. To live in the land of Hatti was to walk always in the presence of the sacred, to see in every stone a story, in every breeze a whisper, in every path a thread between worlds. Though the Hittites left few grand statues and no soaring pyramids, their world was far from barren of beauty. In stone, in bronze, in seal and wall carving, they captured the essence of gods and kings, not to glorify, but to communicate with each other and with the divine. Their art was not designed to impress in scale, but to endure in message. The style was bold and direct. Figures stood in profile, their postures formal, their gestures precise. Gods were marked by horned crowns, robes with flared hems, and emblems of power, such as the sickle-shaped sword or the curling serpent. Kings and queens wore tall hats and broad belts, sometimes with hands raised in greeting or offering. Scenes were rarely chaotic. They showed processions, rituals, feasting, or offerings. The divine and the royal were always composed, always ordered. In this art, the Hittites expressed their most cherished ideal, that the world, even in its strife, could be held together by structure, rite, and law. Relief carvings were among their most lasting legacies. At Yazkaya, the gods are not colossal, but they endure. Lined up in rows, carved into rock, they stride silently through time, a celestial order imprinted upon the earth. These carvings were not decorative. They were functional, acts of worship, reminders of sacred stories, invocations of divine presence. To pass through a gate adorned with lions or sphinxes was to move from one realm into another, protected by watchful spirits. The Lion Gate of Hattusa still stands, its twin beasts worn by centuries of wind, yet still fierce. The King's Gate, likewise, bears a carved warrior, perhaps divine, perhaps royal, standing as both protector and symbol of justice. These gates did not merely open cities. They marked thresholds of identity. Hittite seals, pressed into clay to authorize letters, treaties, and laws, were miniature works of art. They bore intricate scenes, a king before a god, a warrior in triumph, a divine animal in mid-step. Each seal was unique, personal, and charged with meaning. Figurines, often made of clay or bronze, were used in domestic rituals. Some were small images of deities, others animals associated with certain powers. They were placed in homes, carried in procession, or buried as offerings. These were not idols of grandeur, but companions in daily devotion. Even in textiles and pottery, hints of art remained. Geometric patterns, animal motifs, and ritual symbols adorned vessels and clothing, not to display wealth, but to honor tradition. Hittite art spoke softly, but clearly. It was not meant to dominate space, but to fill it with presence. It reflected a culture grounded in belief, law, and continuity. A culture that carved its soul into stone not for spectacle, but for memory. And in those carvings, those simple yet profound faces, the Hittites still speak, from the walls of temples, from the gates of cities, from the long silence of the past. No kingdom rises alone. The Hittites, though secure in their Anatolian heartland, were never isolated. Their destiny was shaped as much by those beyond their borders as by those within. Allies, rivals, and distant strangers all played their part in shaping the world of Hatti. To the east lay the Mitanni, the early masters of northern Mesopotamia, a Hurrian-speaking kingdom of chariots, horses, and ancient rites. For decades, they were the Hittites' greatest rivals. Wars raged between them for control of Syria, for the allegiance of vassals, for the favor of the gods. But there were also times of treaty, carefully worded, divinely sealed. Kings called each other brother, offered daughters in marriage, and exchanged letters thick with ritual courtesy. Yet behind the words was always the struggle, for land, for pride, for supremacy. Further east still loomed Assyria, at first a minor power, but by the end, a looming storm. The Hittites watched as Assyria grew stronger, more ambitious, moving westward like a slow tide. They clashed on the fringes, testing each other's resolve. In the end, it would be Assyria that absorbed much of what the Hittites left behind. To the south was Egypt, distant, yet deeply entwined. From the early raids of Suppiluliuma to the formal Treaty of Kadesh, the Hittite-Egyptian relationship was one of rivalry wrapped in diplomacy. The exchange of royal letters, gifts, and even marriages painted a picture of cautious respect. When Queen Puduhepa corresponded with Rameses II, she did so not as a subordinate, but as an equal. And when a Hittite princess became an Egyptian queen, the bond was sealed in flesh and blood, a rare gesture between great powers. To the west lay Azawa and the land of the Luwians, kindred tongues, shared gods, and frequent strife. These western lands were both threat and kin, rebelling and allying in turn. From here, long after the fall of Hattusa, would rise new voices, perhaps even the ancestors of later Anatolian kingdoms. Further still, across the Aegean, were the Mycenaeans, warriors of the sea, bringers of gold and goods. Their presence was felt more than seen. Hittite texts mention Ahiyawa, possibly Mycenaean Greece, as a power that could not be ignored. They sent ships, demanded lands, interfered in western Anatolia. Hatti was not untouched by their growing presence. And when the late Bronze Age fell into fire and silence, the ships of these western warriors were likely among those that helped bring the curtain down. To the north, in the forests and highlands, dwelled the Kaska, untamed, unyielding, never conquered. They left no writing, no monuments, but their raids and resistance drained Hittite strength for centuries. They were the eternal thorn in the northern flank, the wild shadow that no wall could keep out. Together, these neighbors formed the ring around Hatti, a circle of influence, pressure, exchange, and memory. Through war and alliance, through fear and kinship, the Hittites were shaped not only by what they built, but by what they faced. And in that complex web of power and diplomacy, they rose not as a solitary empire, but as a central force in the great, fragile world of the Late Bronze Age. To live in the Hittite world was to walk between seen and unseen, to move through life with eyes not only on the earth, but on the sky, the wind, the birds. For the Hittites, the world was filled with signs, and to ignore them was to invite ruin. They believed that God spoke not just through priests and dreams, but through everyday events, natural disturbances, and the subtle movements of the world. Their religion was not one of blind faith, but of constant attention to signs, to symbols, to silence. The court of Hattusa employed seers, oracular priests, and diviners. Before a military campaign, a royal marriage, or the signing of a treaty, omens were sought. The flight of birds was watched carefully. The behavior of animals interpreted. The patterns of smoke from incense, the cracks in bones, the shape of oil on water, all were voices of the divine. One common method was the examination of a sheep's liver. A sacrificial animal was offered, and its liver removed and studied. Each lobe and mark was mapped according to known patterns. This was not superstition, but sacred science, a deeply held conviction that the divine will was visible to those trained to read it. There were also dream interpreters. A dream, especially one seen by the king, was never just a private matter. It might be a message from the gods, of favor, or of warning. Dreams were recorded, categorized, and compared. In many cases, ritual responses followed, an offering, a journey, or a cleansing rite to avert harm. The Hittites were also careful to maintain ritual purity. Illness, misfortune, or military defeat could be seen as the result of unfulfilled vows or neglected gods. When something went wrong, the first step was often not punishment, but inquiry. Had a promise to the gods been forgotten? Had a temple ritual been poorly performed? Entire tablets survive describing such investigations, with scribes listing potential divine offenses and proposing rituals of atonement. The goal was always the same, to restore balance between mortals and the divine. The most powerful voice in this system was the storm god. He was not a distant creator, but an active force, bringing rain or drought, thunder or calm. His favor meant harvest. His wrath meant plague. Kings, too, could act as oracles. When Mursili II suffered plague in his land, he prayed publicly and recorded his doubts and fears. He confessed past errors, pleaded for forgiveness, and promised better observance of rites. His vulnerability did not diminish him, it proved his worth as a servant of the gods. In this way, the Hittites revealed a culture not of arrogance, but of attentiveness. Their rituals were not empty. Their omens were not dismissed. They listened to sky, to stone, to the subtle murmur of the world around them. In their silence, we see not superstition, but humility, the wisdom of a people who knew that no empire lasts forever, and that the divine speaks not in thunder alone, but in the rustle of wings, and the quiet shift of shadow. When the last Hittite king laid down his scepter, and the last scribe pressed his final tablet into clay, the world did not pause to remember. The stones of Hattusa grew cold, the gates of Carchemish fell silent, and the name of Hatti faded from living tongues. Yet even in absence, the Hittites lingered. Far to the south, in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, they appeared, not as emperors or priests, but as a distant people of Canaan, one among many tribes in a land of shifting power. Abraham speaks to Hittites. Esau marries a Hittite woman. Uriah, husband of Bathsheba, is called the Hittite, though he fights in King David's army. These were echoes, not records. The biblical Hittites were likely descendants of those Syro-Hittite states that survived the empire's collapse, peoples who retained some identity, perhaps some names and gods, but who no longer ruled from mountain citadels. In classical literature, Greek and Roman, the Hittites were forgotten altogether. Their language, their gods, their empire had vanished from the known world. The great age of bronze lay buried under layers of iron and dust. Hattusa was overgrown. Yazkiah stood in wind and silence. What remained were rumors, tales of ancient peoples who once rivaled Egypt, who vanished like mist. But no one could name them. It would not be until the 19th century that the first pieces returned to light, strange inscriptions in unknown hieroglyphs, unfamiliar names in ancient Egyptian texts, clay tablets pulled from the earth of Boscawen. And in the early 20th century, the name came back, Hittites. Not as imagined in the Bible, but as rulers of empire, builders of cities, makers of law and treaty. The rediscovery was not only archaeological. It was a reweaving of history, a revelation that the Bronze Age was more complex than once believed, that power had once flowed from the Anatolian plateau as surely as from the Nile or the Euphrates. And with it came humility. That whole empires could be forgotten. That whole languages could vanish. That cities like Hattusa could fall, be lost, and only centuries later whisper again. Today, the Hittites are part of the grand story once more, and not as a footnote, but as a chapter of meaning. Their laws are studied. Their treaties admired. Their rituals puzzled over. Their gods remembered in carvings of wind-worn stone. They are no longer merely the Hittites of biblical verse, nor the nameless others in Egyptian stele. They are what they were, the people of Hatti. Lords of bronze and storm. Builders of balance in a fragile world. And though their story faded, it did not end. It only waited, like all ancient truths, for time to turn back and listen. Before the steel blades of Rome or the iron legions of Assyria, there was bronze, the warm, golden alloy of copper and tin that shaped the weapons, tools, and dreams of the Hittite world. In the hands of Hittite warriors, bronze became both symbol and instrument. With it, they carved out a kingdom and held it against all odds. Their swords, spears, and axes were forged not only for conquest, but for ceremony, gleaming reminders of the king's divine mandate and the warrior's sacred role. The process of bronze making was itself a ritual of transformation. Copper was drawn from Anatolia's mountains, smelted, purified, cast. Tin, rarer and more precious, came by trade from far in the east. When the two metals met in fire, bronze was born, harder than either alone, capable of holding an edge and a story. The Hittite sword was often short and leaf-shaped, designed for close combat and agility. Warriors carried round shields of leather stretched over wooden frames, sometimes rimmed with bronze. Helmets were conical, with flaps to guard the cheeks, and armor was worn in the form of layered linen, bronze scales, or padded garments. The chariot, central to Hittite warfare, was also a platform of weaponry. Spears and bows rained down from its riders. Quivers held arrows tipped with bronze, their shafts carefully shaped for balance and range. Precision mattered, in craftsmanship and in war. The blacksmiths who made these tools were not ordinary artisans. They were craftsmen of the sacred, working with flame, metal, and incantation. The forge was a place of heat and risk, not only to the body, but to the spirit. Mistakes could offend the gods. Perfection could bring favor. Weapons also bore inscriptions. Some were offerings to the gods, placed in temples or buried in sacred ground. Others bore the names of kings, reminders of who had commissioned them, or wielded them in battle. They were not only tools, but extensions of honor and memory. Yet for all their mastery of bronze, the Hittites stood on the threshold of a new age. Iron, still rare and mysterious, had begun to appear in ceremonial blades and royal gifts. It was difficult to forge, demanding greater heat and technique, but it promised strength. The Hittites were among the first to experiment with it, though they never fully replaced bronze in their armies. Still, they knew what it could mean. Some scholars believe they guarded their knowledge of iron-making carefully, trading iron blades as prestige items rather than common arms. In time, iron would sweep across the known world, changing warfare forever. But in the age of Hattusa, it was still bronze that ruled the field, bronze that shone in the sun above chariot wheels, bronze that defended temples, signed treaties, and shaped kingship. The weapons of the Hittites were not only forged in fire, they were forged in belief. Each blade carried more than an edge. It carried the weight of empire, the hope of victory, and the silence of those who fell before it. An empire does not run on warriors and priests alone. Beneath the chariots and the temples, behind the scribes and their tablets, lay the true foundation of the Hittite world, the land, and what it could yield. Agriculture was the heartbeat of the economy. Grain, above all else, sustained life, fed soldiers, filled royal granaries, and flowed as tribute from vassal lands. Wheat and barley were the staples, planted in the highland soil with care and reverence. Fields were tilled by hand and plough, watered by the sky, guarded by the gods. Every harvest was a gamble, every drought a crisis. When the rains failed or frost struck early, the temples filled with prayers, and the palace grew anxious. Famine could topple thrones just as easily as war. In good years, surplus was stored in massive silos, managed by royal officials, measured by weight, and recorded on clay. Livestock, too, were wealth, sheep for wool, cattle for ploughing, goats for milk, pigs for meat. Herds were counted and taxed. Their health was a matter not just of economy, but of omen. Diseased flocks meant divine displeasure. Beyond farming, the Hittites organized an intricate system of tribute and labor. The king did not tax with coin, there was little of it, but with goods and service. Vassal cities sent carts of grain, bolts of cloth, jars of oil, bricks of copper and tin. They sent craftsmen and soldiers, singers for festivals, even their own sons as hostages of loyalty. Work was also a duty. Royal building projects, walls, roads, temples, required labor from across the empire. Artisans carved stone, laid bricks, glazed pottery. Some were professionals. Others were bound by obligation. A farmer might owe weeks of work each year to the crown. Trade connected the Hittites to the wider world. Tin came from the east, copper from the Taurus, silver from the western hills. From Syria came wine and glass, from Egypt rare woods and perfumes. Markets bustled with exchange, but most of the economy remained state-controlled, regulated by scribes and sanctified by ritual. There was little private wealth in the modern sense. Land was allocated by the king, managed by temples, or inherited within families under strict rules. Contracts were recorded, disputes settled, and debts measured in silver or grain. Slavery existed, often as punishment or consequence of war, but slaves could earn freedom and were not without legal standing. The Hittite economy was not driven by growth, but by stability, by the need to feed a kingdom, fulfill sacred obligations, and maintain balance. It was an economy of enough. In the quiet lines of their accounting tablets, in the storerooms of palaces, in the furrows carved into highland fields, the Hittites revealed what truly sustained them. Not gold, nor conquest, but the steady rhythm of planting and harvest, of giving and receiving, of duty rendered in wheat and labor, so that temples might thrive, and the land endure. When empires fall, they often vanish from sight, buried beneath centuries of forest and forgetfulness. Yet even after silence descends, there are places where memory lingers. Hattusa, once the proud seat of the Hittite kings, did not disappear in flame or fury. It simply quieted. After the final rulers laid down the crown and the scribes pressed their last tablets, the people of Hattusa began to leave. Some drifted south to the Syro-Hittite states. Others returned to smaller villages, places untouched by empire. The Great Wall stood, unmanned. The temples emptied of offerings. The archives, still full, were sealed by wind and time. And yet, the city did not vanish at once. For a while, life continued. Shepherds may have wandered its edges. Local cults likely persisted, honoring familiar gods among the ruins. Travelers from the south may have passed through, unaware that the stones beneath their feet once bore the weight of kings. But as the Iron Age advanced, and new peoples claimed Anatolia, Hattusa was left to the hills. Trees grew over its courtyards. Roots cracked its foundations. Earth swallowed its gates. By the time the Greeks wrote their histories, the city's name was lost. Still, its bones endured. When the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began his excavations in the early 20th century, he found not only walls and temples, but voices. Thousands of clay tablets lay buried in what had once been the royal archives. Treaties, laws, letters, prayers, they emerged from the earth like echoes returning from a long-forgotten call. Piece by piece, the city returned. The great double walls were mapped. The Lion Gate restored. The sacred precincts of temples uncovered. Carvings at Yazkiah once again saw the sun. And through the deciphering of the Hittite language, Nesali, the words of kings, priests, and scribes came back to life. Today, Hattusa stands once more, not as a city of rule, but as a city of memory. Its streets are quiet, but its stones speak. Its gates open not for tribute bearers, but for those who listen. In the shadow of the Taurus Mountains, the old capital watches the wind pass over its ruins, carrying with it fragments of stories once thought lost. Empires burn. Names fade. But beneath the surface of silence, history waits. And in Hattusa, the last ember of the Hittite world still glows, not with conquest, but with remembrance. In the shadow of vanished empires, it is often the grandest gestures that survive, temples of marble, armies of conquest, myths sung across ages. Yet the Hittites left behind no towering pyramids, no Homeric epics. What remains is subtler, but no less profound. They left behind balance. The legacy of the Hittites lies not in dominance, but in discipline, the quiet strength of law, the humility before gods, the steadiness of ritual in a chaotic world. Their greatness was not built on spectacle, but on continuity. A kind of order, sacred, deliberate, and human, placed in the heart of an untamed land. Their legal code spoke not in thunder, but in reasoned lines of fairness. Their kings prayed in fear as well as pride. Their scribes wrote not only of war, but of festivals, harvests, and dreams. Their queens did not stand behind the throne, but beside it. Even their gods, numerous and varied, did not demand uniformity. The Hittite pantheon was not a weapon, but a shelter, a home for every mountain, every river, every voice of the empire, however small. They taught that kings were not divine, only chosen, unanswerable. They believed that a broken promise could unmake a kingdom, that a forgotten prayer could wither crops, that peace was not weakness but wisdom. And perhaps most surprisingly, they listened. When omens spoke, when the sky changed, when the people cried, the Hittite state responded not with silence or denial, but with ritual, inquiry, and reform. In this, they were not timeless, they were human, deeply and intimately so. Today, their influence is woven quietly into the study of ancient law, diplomacy, and belief. The first known written treaty between great powers, the Treaty of Kadesh, carries their name. Their laws shaped later codes. Their language revealed the roots of Indo-European speech. Their gods whispered into the cults of Greece, Rome, and beyond. And the stones of Hattusa still stand, battered, but upright. The storm they worshipped has long passed. The kings sleep. The scribes are dust. But the spirit of Hatti, its careful strength, its fierce quiet, its enduring balance, remains. Not in dominion, but in memory. For centuries, the name of the Hittites was a whisper in ancient texts, half myth, half riddle. They appeared in Egyptian records, in the Hebrew Bible, in scattered rumors carved into stone. Yet no one knew where they had lived, what tongue they had spoken, or whether they had truly ruled as kings of old. Then the earth gave up its secrets. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as archaeology stirred the dust of forgotten lands, explorers came to central Anatolia, to the hills near Bozkır. There, among farmers' fields and wind-carved cliffs, they began to uncover something vast: stone gates, walls, tablets, fragments of a city that had once ruled an empire. Hattusa. German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, working with Ottoman support, led the early excavations. What he found was astonishing: thousands of clay tablets, pressed with cuneiform, written not only in Akkadian but in a language no one had seen before. A language that called itself Nesili, the language of Nesha. The language of the Hittites. It was Bedit Rosny, in 1915, who first cracked the code. He translated a simple phrase, "You will eat bread, and you will drink water." And in that moment, the Hittites returned from silence. The tablets revealed not myth, but memory, of treaties with Egypt, laws for farmers and slaves, prayers to gods long silent. The gates of Hattusa were mapped. The procession of deities at Yazkaya was studied. Entire festivals were reconstructed, step by step, from dusty clay. Scholars learned of kings who had once defied Egypt, written to Babylon, ruled over Syria. They read of plagues and peace, dreams and disasters. They learned not only what the Hittites did, but how they thought, believed, and hoped. Hattusa became one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. A window not into legend, but into lived reality, an empire that had ruled quietly, efficiently, and then disappeared without leaving behind a single myth. And with this rediscovery came a shift in how we view the ancient world. The Hittites are no longer a footnote. They are a pillar, one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Mycenae. Their language, now the oldest deciphered Indo-European tongue, is studied by linguists. Their law codes and treaties are compared with later systems. Their city planning and archives are admired by historians. Archaeology gave them back to us, not in gold or grandeur, but in words. It is fitting. For the Hittites, more than any other people of their age, believed in the power of the written record, in the duty to remember, to record, to pass on what must not be lost. And because they wrote, we can now listen. The rediscovery of the Hittites was not the end of their story, it was the beginning of ours. Once the name of Hatti rose again from the earth, a new field was born, Hittitology, the study of a civilization once thought lost, now revealed piece by piece through tablets, stones, and the relentless care of scholars. Hittitology is not merely archaeology. It is a dialogue with a complex, multifaceted world, one of diplomacy and divinity, of law and longing, of thunder gods and grain taxes. To study the Hittites is to step into a culture both foreign and familiar, where the ancient heart of humanity still beats beneath layers of dust. The work is slow, precise, and deeply human. Scholars labor over fragmentary tablets, assembling meanings from shattered clay. They compare treaty formulas, translate ritual texts, map ancient cities. They debate the order of kings, the placement of gates, the meaning of dreams. There is no single book of the Hittites, only 1,000 voices, scattered and half heard. Every tablet found is a new thread. Some speak of foreign alliances, letters between kings, heavy with courtesy and veiled threat. Others hold prayers whispered in times of plague or lists of deities invoked in long-lost ceremonies. Some are records of trade, or judgments of law, or the birth of royal children. None are meaningless. As more texts have emerged, from Hattusa, from Karshemish, from Anatolian highlands and Syrian plains, the map of the Hittite world has expanded. Once a shadow on the edge of Egypt's vision, the empire of Hatti now stands in full light. Today, universities teach Hittite grammar. Museums house their artifacts. Conferences gather scholars to debate the shape of a temple or the name of a queen. What was once unknown has become a field rich in insight, still unfolding, still incomplete, yet vibrant. And in this scholarly labor lies a deeper truth. The past is not given. It must be recovered, reconstructed, respected. The Hittites remind us that history is fragile, that whole civilizations can vanish, not only in war, but in silence. And yet, if we listen closely, they return. Not as ghosts, but as neighbors. Through the hands of those who study, translate, and preserve, the people of Hatti speak again. Their laws instruct. Their prayers move. Their treaties inspire. And their memory teaches us how empires are built and how they are remembered. In this way, Hittitology is not simply about the past. It is about the endurance of human voice and the quiet triumph of remembrance over time. What endures of a people long vanished? Not their palaces, for those crumble. Not their names, for even kings are forgotten. Not their gods, for new gods always come. And yet, something remains. Something shaped not in marble or gold, but in clay, in thought, in the quiet courage of order. The Hittites have no Homer. No Herodotus sang their praises. Their empire was not revived by later glory, nor remembered in folk tales. Their rediscovery came not through legend, but through labor, the work of hands and eyes and quiet minds. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson they leave us. They show us that a civilization need not burn bright to leave warmth. That strength can lie not in conquest, but in continuity. That justice, ritual, and record-keeping are as vital to the human spirit as music and myth. They show us the fragility of power, yes, but also the dignity of structure. A society that believed law should be fair, that kings should pray, that queens could govern, and that gods were many, but none jealous. A people who watched the skies not with arrogance, but with humility. They remind us, too, of how little we know. For centuries, their empire stood among the great powers of the earth. Then, for centuries more, it vanished. And when it returned, it brought with it not only facts, but questions about what it means to be remembered, and what it means to be forgotten. We live in a time flooded by images, by sound, by the desire to be seen. The Hittites lived in a time of silence, of duty, of slow and sacred cycles. They carved their prayers in stone. They spoke to gods through fire and smoke. They recorded their laws so carefully, it is as though they knew someone, one day, would read them. And we have. In a fragment of treaty. In a statue's gaze. In the scratch of a stylus across clay. They are there. Teaching us still, that to endure is not to conquer, but to care. To build not only walls, but words. To leave behind not only power, but meaning. And so we come to the end of a long and quiet journey, across mountains and markets, through temples and treaties, in the footsteps of kings and scribes, chariots and prayers. The story of the Hittites, the lords of bronze and iron, is not one of fire and glory, but of rhythm, reason, and remembrance. They rose not as conquerors alone, but as stewards of balance. In a world often ruled by chaos, they chose order. In an age of kings who called themselves gods, they ruled humbly, as servants of the divine and guardians of the land. Their power was real, but it was measured, not only in chariots and stone, but in justice, duty, and devotion. They held the middle of the world, between Egypt and Babylon, between storm and sun, between old gods and new. And when the winds of collapse swept the ancient world, the Hittites did not fall in a blaze of defiance. They faded, slowly, with dignity, like the last note of a solemn hymn. Yet they were not lost. Because they wrote, we read. Because they prayed, we remember. Because they carved their gods in stone and recorded their kings in clay, their voices crossed the silence of millennia. Today, we know their cities. We speak their names. We hear their thoughts, pressed gently into the earth, now carried back into light. And in doing so, we restore them, not as shadows or footnotes, but as one of the great peoples of the ancient world. The Hittites were never seekers of fame. Their glory was quiet. But it was real. They built an empire with bronze, guided by ritual. They glimpsed the future in iron, guarded by law. And they left behind not monuments of pride, but echoes of wisdom. Let us remember them, then, not for their fall, but for their form. Not for their silence, but for their structure. Not for their myths, but for their memory. For they, too, were part of the great unfolding, a voice in the long song of humankind. The lords of bronze and iron have spoken. And we have listened.